Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, which is Meet the Press, a discussion with University of California Press, Princeton University Press, and University of Pennsylvania Press. Before I start today's session, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules, and that is that today's session is being recorded. We will be happy to send over the link to the recording post the session, and you're more than welcome to share this with your colleagues. The other thing is that we invite any comments, questions, or concerns that you may have. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat box that you see at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to drop them during the session. I will collate these questions and present them to the moderator at the end of the session. With that, I think we can dive right into our session today. And I'd like to start off by introducing the moderator of today's session, Michael Zioli. Michael Zioli is the Senior Advisor of Publisher Partnerships at De Gruyter, and some of you might actually know him from his time at YBP and Gopi, where he was the Vice President for Publisher Relations. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mike. Mike, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks. This is our second discussion with University Press leadership in North America. And I think it's a unique opportunity to actually break down some of those generalizations. We've all said, oh, publishers, or oh, libraries. But we all know when we think about it, there are all kinds of libraries and there are all kinds of publishers. And even within the university press community, there's a wide variety of presses, and they really are all unique, kind of like snowflakes, each one different. And so today we have Princeton University Press, University of Pennsylvania Press, and University of California Press. And we're going to have a very casual, hopefully very engaging conversation with them. First, I'd like each of them to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their background, how they got to be where they are, what their responsibilities are, and what's unique about their press so that we start to see what's different in each of them. Brigitte, would you like to start for Princeton?
Sure. I'm really happy to be here and get this opportunity to talk to my colleagues at the library. And Michael just said that we have a large variety of librarians with us, some from Germany, some from Canada, and maybe even further afoot, which ties well into the theme of Princeton University Press being very much a global university press. So that's what we have, said our strategy is going to be, a decade or 15 years ago. I've been very fortunate to have been at the press for over 30 years in very different capacities. I started out in sales, then headed sub-rights, but spent most of my time really in the editorial department. I've been the press's history editor for over 20 years. And have had a wonderful time acquiring history books. I was the editorial director for 10 years, directing the press's program, the entire program, sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And I'm now very fortunate to have been able to create a new role for myself, that of the Director of Global Development, in which capacity I work with our Beijing office, which we established in 2017, which has a staff of 6, and our also newly created IP department, Intellectual Property Department, which also comprises the digital and audio publisher, which is responsible in the digital realm for the digital contents that we sell through aggregators to libraries. So I've really, it's kind of strange, I think, that I have been at one press, but I've been in many, many different roles.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brigitte. Mary, shall we move to Penn and tell us what's happening there?
Hi. I'm Mary Francis, and I am the director at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and I'm a relatively new director, almost 2 years, not quite, Previous to that, I was the editorial director at the University of Michigan Press, and I spent the longest portion of my career at the institution that Tim now leads at California, where I was for more than 16 years as an editor, principally dealing with the arts and humanities, but now I'm a director, and so I wear all the hats. Penn is, let's see, University of Pennsylvania. This is a theme that maybe we'll talk about a little bit, although we haven't yet. It's a private institution like Princeton. California, of course, a public, one of the biggest and the best. And that does always make a difference. We publish books and journals like California, unlike Princeton. And we do have some distribution clients. They're mostly partners from Penn's campus who do publishing of their own, and we distribute the books for them. The press has been around since the 1890s, one of our very first books, and still one of our bestsellers, Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro. We're very much about history. We are a press that is about the history of the Atlantic world, of the American Republic, of the peoples and cultures of North America, of Philadelphia itself, a complicated and cosmopolitan place, all the way from the Declaration of Independence to the Move bombing, but also Mary Cassatt and Patti LaBelle, David Lynch, the Philly Sound. One thing that grows out of our identity as part of this amazing place that we're based is urban studies as a great strength alongside history. Our history isn't just the history of the Atlantic world and the Americas, but also we're very strong in the medieval and Renaissance periods. We do a lot of anthropology, contemporary anthropology, political science. So that's sort of our profile. And Ben Franklin is our tutelary spirit, and I'll try not to evoke him too many times, but I've sort of gotten into practice of that since I've been on campus here.
More on that to come then. A penny saved is a penny earned when we get to the business part of the discussion. Thanks, Mary. Well, Tim, how's the West Coast doing? Can you tell us about California?
Yeah, we're not on fire yet, so things are looking okay out there. I'm Tim Sullivan. I'm the director of the University of California Press. At one time, I worked for Brigida at Princeton. That's where I got my start. She was my boss and my mentor, and wonderful at both of those jobs. And then I moved, so I was at Princeton. I did sociology and economics for around 10 years, and then moved and worked in the trade in New York for a few years, and then went to Harvard Business Review, where I was the editorial director, and ran Harvard Business Review Press for about a decade before I came to California 3 years ago as director, and was really happy to come back to the University Press. I think of us as a family, where we compete, but we're colleagues. So I've been here about 3 years, almost exactly 3 years. So the press, a little bit about the press, founded in 1893. And we were founded kind of as a branding exercise, I think, for the University of California. We published what was called scientific monographs then. The first one was a study of the geology of Monterey Bay. And then it was a way for the university to invest in faculty, but also then to send those monographs off to libraries back east and in Europe as kind of proof of the kind of work that was going on in California, since, compared to some universities, we were pretty late to the game, so to speak. Now, you obviously expanded over the years, shifted in publishing directions, really became a modern publisher in the 50s and 60s. And now we publish around 200 books a year. Around 65% of those are what we would call scholarly monographs. The other 35% are course books, textbooks, and trade books. We have about 45 journals across mostly the humanities, although we're expanding the remit of the journal program. And in our book publishing program, we publish very strong in sociology, particularly in ethnography, public health, American studies and history, music and film, the ancient world. And then we have new lists in kind of returning to environmental studies, which we hadn't done in a while. We have a new technology studies list. We're just in the process of hiring a new editor kind of broadly in the sciences, although we're not quite sure what they're going to do, but it's the kind of job I would love to have, to be able to go off and do broad acquisitions in science. And a new economics list. In terms of direction, I think of as a very progressive publisher as befits the University of California and the state of California. We really see our mission as cleaving to the University of California, which is broad, diverse, lively. It's huge. You know, we have 10 campuses, 3 national labs, medical centers. So we can't wrap our arms around all of that, but we're doing our best to kind of pick and choose where we play in that. It's also an incredibly diverse state. It's 65% people of color. That's reflected in both faculty and the student body, and also has a real mission around first-generation scholarship. So people who are coming to the academy for the very first time, and we see them as an important constituency for UC Press as well.
Fantastic. And Tim, you'll tell our audience where to send their resumes for the editor for the sciences position.
Absolutely.
Sounds like a great job. You know, last conversation, we had Alan Harvey here from Stanford University Press. And one of the interesting things, probably one of the most interesting things that came out of that discussion was he said that when he started at Stanford, about 30% of his sales, as best he could tell, because some of them you're really not sure about when they're going through intermediaries, but he said about 30% he figured were going to academic libraries. And most recently, he said that's down to about 18%. I wonder if you all have a good handle on how much of your content is ending up in academic libraries versus other places. Should we follow the same order, Brigitte?
Sure. I think the E part of this equation is much easier to know than the print part, because the digital sales happen mostly through the aggregators, and that's about around 9% now. The print part to libraries is much more difficult because, I mean, the main part goes through Baker and Taylor. And then there is, of course, the international component. So, for example, most of the sales through our Beijing office is institutional. So it is to library. But that is, but overall, that's not always easy to capture, because libraries also order, of course, could order through Amazon or other channels. I mean, I think that it's probably anywhere between 12 and 15%. But I actually talked with our director of sales about this yesterday, and I think that's probably where we'd land on. I mean, it's as you said, I mean, it used to be the lion's share of many of the university presses, Princeton included, 30, 35 years or so ago. You know, when we published monographs, a major percentage of those monograph sales were going to libraries, and we could count on that. And that hasn't been true for a very, very long time, which is part of the reason why all university presses really had to diversify and had to, you know, branch out into other areas. And in, you know, Princeton's case, this was very much a strategy of editors. So we have 19 editors currently, 3 editors in the UK office in Woodstock near Oxford, and 16 in the US, that all of our editors publish a variety of books, from monograph, first-time work, to academic trade books, to textbooks, to reference books, to diversify the list and to really, you know, get that balance that you need in order for you to have sustainable publishing. That was a long answer.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Brigitte. Mary?
I mean, I don't have a lot to add to what Brigitte said, except to say that as far as we can tell, she is correct. It has shrunk over time, but it is still significant. And I would say that, maybe to link to something that, Mike, I know you want us to talk a little bit about, we view libraries as a really important constituency because we are a mission-driven publisher, and because we are principally in the business of translating advanced, sophisticated scholarship to users alive today, to users in the future, et cetera. And libraries are the vehicle for keeping those, those readers engaged into the future. So even as the percentage goes down, it's still a constituency we pay a lot of attention to.
And Tim?
Yeah, I would say our experience reflects exactly what Brigitte and Mary both talked about: declining percent of sales, harder to tell exactly what's going where because of the diversity of intermediaries, but still an incredibly important constituency because we know that's where our main audience, our scholars, or one of our most important constituencies is finding our work. Right. So, and that's part of that building blocks of knowledge that we feel is fundamental. We don't talk about them as mission books, monographs, even though that's I think when other folks talk about it, we think of Oliver Publishing as part of our mission, whether it's translating books for a general public or doing relatively narrow monographs that we know are going to be, bought by a handful of scholars and be in libraries as a repository. But that is an incredibly important constituency because they do reach this kind of core audience for us.
I think that was surprising to us at De Gruyter when Ellen came out with that figure of 18% of their business being academic libraries. You think of university presses as their primary constituency as the library, but it's just 1/5 at best of it for many university presses, something to really think about. Which brings me to my next topic. And Tim, I'm gonna have we'll reverse the order here. But yesterday or Monday on the Scholarly Kitchen, there was an article by Joe Esposito, which was reprinted from several years ago, but it's an excellent article comparing or talking about the mission-driven, not-for-profit publisher, and he's thinking primarily of university presses, but also societies, et cetera, and how they face competing with commercial presses and the skill set that is unique for publishers. But very often scholars think that, if you're an expert in chemistry, if that's your field, then you should be able to be an expert about publishing in chemistry. And it's just not the same. So there are a lot of challenges in being a not-for-profit scholarly press and being sustainable, which you've all mentioned. How do you deal with that? Especially coming from Harvard Business Review, maybe Tim, you have some special insight about sustainability and the not-for-profit press. What does it take? How do you think about your mission in that context?
Yeah, I would say I'm probably the least qualified to talk about it because Mary and Brigitte have been dealing with their entire careers of how do you manage this. And I'm a relative newcomer to it. We're diversified. We're incredibly diversified across our revenue streams and product types. So, if you think about the bulk, 3/4 of our revenue is coming from our book sales. The innovations there over the past 30 years have been diversification away from just monograph publishing, and that's happened across all university presses and I really do think of that as, when we talk about innovation in publishing, oftentimes we talk about technology, and I actually think the innovation is in operations and in the kind of books we publish. To both, and that's about diversifying into new audiences as well, which means you have to have access to new channels. And then about 1/4 of our revenue comes from our journal program, and that is on a slow decline, honestly, because that is all institutional market, and we know what's happening to library budgets. And I think that's going to be this, especially what we've seen over the past year, where library budgets were hit particularly hard by COVID and by cuts across universities, even if that funding may be coming back as it is in the UC system in the new fiscal year. But that's not a dynamic that's going to change, and that's really difficult to wrestle with. And then we have other sources of income too. We only get about 5% funding from the university that goes to support UC faculty. And then we have a foundation. So we're engaged in fundraising to help support the kind of publishing that we're doing. And that's a major pitch that we do is, I will show you the profit and loss statement for our monographs, and it is not pretty, and we do not make it up in volume. And so that's a pitch that you're making to people who believe in quality publishing and in quality scholarship. That's one way that we can go about sustaining that. So it is about really a diversity of different kinds of income streams to help support mission-driven publishing, which is all of our publishing, as I said.
Mary?
I really love Tim's perspective, because diversification of various kinds is key. And, I'll reflect that a little bit. The mission of, I tend to think about that diversification as being also about the communities that we serve. And scholarly communication, like the rest of higher education, like the rest of this country that we are broadcasting from, is changing rapidly. And so mission as serving the needs of that community. And again, the way we have, both a journals program and books. We also do distribution, as I mentioned, for clients on Penn's campus who have, the need to get their own books out there. And, being able to pay attention to the needs of scholars who tend to work in journals rather than books to get their scholarship out there, for example, is important to our mission, staying ahead of those curves. Also reflecting, the needs of our parent institution. Penn is a big place and, represents so much fantastic activity, maybe not as big as that 10 campus system that, Tim's System Press represents, but still a very dynamic place. And finding, again, staying ahead of the needs that originate there, the way that those faculty members, staff, students as well, can point us to how those trends are affecting the global scholarly communication ecosystem, I like to call it. That to me is a key part of the mission. And as Tim said, community in Philadelphia on our campus among all of our scholars, I think of it as very broad. And some of that support does come from those folks who can, like the people who are on our board, a couple of whom are on this call, I'm happy to say, who really believe in that mission, who believe that scholarly communication is important to a healthy society, and so can support us in other ways. Maybe they're not an author, but they have other reasons to be committed to what we're trying to do. So, Tim is absolutely right. All those constituencies are important, and the constituencies are as diverse as the products we publish.
Brigitte.
Yes, I think it is an incredible privilege to be working at a university press where basically that is mission driven, or, as we used to say, not for profit. I like mission driven much better. Our mission being that we bring scholarly ideas to the world, and publishing the really very stringently peer-reviewed books, where we put a lot of effort in proposals and working with authors to publish the very best books that we can, and then bring them to readers and authors all around the world. And in particular, since we opened the office in Beijing, we very much see ourselves also as connectors between East and West, and especially during the recent Trump administration. That has been that has incredibly motivated my colleagues in the Beijing office, that mission, that they were really involved in this mission of connecting East and West, and has also really inspired my colleagues in the US and UK offices. And I already mentioned that one strategy was the global approach. Like several years ago, we looked at each of our lists and analyze them and and looked at, which books traveled better globally, which were, maybe too narrowly focused just on US concerns, which isn't at all to say that we aren't publishing, US centric topics, but we really try to, since we also have a UK and European office, we really try to become as globally relevant as possible. And now with the creation of the Beijing office, this is even more of a global encompass. And when we are talking to libraries, we don't just think about the US and Europe and UK, but we're also thinking about libraries in China and in Asia and elsewhere. I mean, for example, we are just in the process of establishing a library board because, like what Mary said, libraries are really, really important to us. And I think we have maybe for far too long neglected in engaging directly with them. So Goldleaf in the UK is helping us to establish a library board, which will be very global in nature, so we can actually get some more feedback from librarians directly. We have also at the press formed a library group, which works cross-departmental, which we've never had before, where somebody is engaged with public libraries, which is another important area that we shouldn't neglect. The international sales director, the digital publisher, and the digital distributor, and the director of our IP department they're all part of that. So we are really for the first time trying to figure out what these different markets are and how we can serve them better. And also, well, we will probably talk about the various models and the various people who offer our content down the line. But we feel that we have for too long neglected engaging with this in a way that we really ought to. So we are engaged in this in a major way now, and I'm really, really happy about that.
Brigitte, you brought up so many wonderful topics there. For example, I was looking at your title list lately, and you had a book published in the law classifications in the case, and it was about religious expression in public spaces in the UK. And normally that would have excluded that title from most libraries because they would say, well, it's UK centric. But topics like that have become really global in nature. Other ones are on Indigenous peoples, where you might have collected Native American or First Nations if you were in Canada. Now you're interested in Indigenous peoples globally and looking at that. But we can't go down that path right now. The other thing you brought up, though, that I thought was wonderful was forming library boards within the press, because I think for as long as I can remember, vendors have gotten between the publisher and the library, right? And it's like, well, it's a game of telephone, which doesn't always work out well. Or the messages get passed back and forth, but in between there's distortion and spin and all that stuff. So that's good to hear. But maybe we should move to some of these questions. So there's one about patron-driven acquisitions and how it's working out. Let me frame that question and give it a little bit more context. As the marketplace has shifted, we have had the old companies, Blackwell's, Coutts, YBP, all sort of be subsumed by larger book companies, Ingram, Baker and Taylor, and then those companies divesting, and the technology companies like EBSCO and ProQuest, et cetera, take over. And so there's been a morphing of this library distribution system. You would think, well, so we just pay different people, but it all comes out in the wash, but it doesn't, because the reason for that change is the development of technology. And so technology-driven companies have taken over the market. And what that has meant, not just is a simple change in format, well, the print book is now an ebook, but it's meant that the ways that those books are delivered and consumed and the marketplace for them has changed with the technology and new things that technology has permitted. So in the old days, when I started, and some of you started, a level playing field was, well, the print book. It's the same for everybody. The paperback is this, and the cloth bound costs this. And it was pretty simple. And your discount is 15%, or actually it would have been less, maybe 10%. As we've gone to E and the models have grown up, we've now got not just purchasing a single user or a 3-user or a nonlinear lending or a DRM-free book, but now you can buy collections. You can get different kinds of collections. Arguably, EBA is a collection, right? You get this big collection of books, and then based on usage, somebody makes a decision on which ones to buy. We hope based on usage, but maybe it's not. Maybe there are better criteria. And you've got PDA or DDA. So the idea of a level playing field is no longer the same. It's not just a print and a cloth book with a fixed price. You've got DDA from JSTOR, which is very different in how it works from DDA on EBSCO, for example. You as publishers need to evaluate all these models. You need to understand them and then decide how you're going to participate because you have options. This is a long question, but I wanted to give it some context. There's a lot to think about in that. And I'm sure you don't just say, yeah, we'll do it and sign a contract. You have to have some process for evaluating and making your decision to be in this or that and how to price it. It's complicated. I don't know, do I have a volunteer to start?
I'll just add one thing because I think others can add much more, including my colleague Laura, who's joining the session. You demonstrated the complexity, Mike. None of us have to say anything more about that. There's format complexity, there's what the libraries prefer, there's pricing, there's the challenges of some of these models that don't deliver revenue as quickly to the publisher, so the publisher must consider assuming a greater amount of risk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you touched on, you called them technology companies, but many technology companies are for profit. This is another thing that we not-for-profits often think about. And I have been known to say this to librarians, to the provost who I report to. Some people refer to this as bibliodiversity. Universities, colleges, public libraries, none of them are for-profit institutions. And yet we are renters, tenants sometimes of systems that are entirely for profit. Should we be doing that? Is that wise? Is that going to have negative effects down the line on our host institutions and on their constituents, many of whom, like first-generation students, are vulnerable when they are put into the hands of folks whose motivation is purely profit? So I would say that's another factor that we try to consider as best we can. Are we able to work with a partner who is like for like in terms of being mission rather than profit driven? If we can, we will.
Laura, you've joined us and the others have had the advantage of introducing themselves. So maybe before we proceed with our responses to this question, would you introduce yourself? And if you have anything to say on this topic, please do.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Laura Waldron. I'm the marketing director at University of Pennsylvania Press. And I predate Mary by a little bit. This is going to take it in a different direction, but it's also coming back to something you had said earlier, Michael, and that question you had, and that was skill sets. And I was kind of reminded of an analogy about people in publishing and University Press publishing. Their skill set is exactly what we tell humanities students who are now graduating with their newly minted degrees, and that is you have to have flexibility, you have to have a willingness to learn, and you have to be able to assess knowledge. So I think that's a lot of how we make decisions, in this kind of changing landscape. It's very volatile. COVID has thrown us a lot of different curveballs. So we have to look at the knowledge and the data we have and think, what's going to happen here? What can we forecast? So a lot of our discussions are about forecasting.
Tim, I'm going to save you for last because we're going to morph into open access in a minute, but I want to keep pushing on this question a bit. So, Brigitte, if you wouldn't mind, about how many distribution partners do you have? I think I remember a number around 50.
Yeah.
And what's happening at Princeton in terms of thinking about this curated partnership, even playing field thing?
Right. So I should confess that I'm relatively new to this, as is my colleague Kim Williams, who who is the digital and audio publisher at the press. She also publishes audiobooks. So we are both still on a steep learning curve. What had happened really at the press is that over the last 10 or so years, the marketing director and the digital publisher, signed on with as many partners as they could, because it was just such a new area and such a fast exploding area. At one point, I remember our marketing director said, "Well, print books are history. It will all just be ebooks." And of course, he was very wrong about that, as print remains very, very strong. But anyway, not to veer from the topic, a lot of partners were signed on with a lot of different models. And so what we inherited when we took over this area about 2 years or so ago, it was just like a labyrinth. There were, different models, different as I said, we were on a steep learning curve, EBA, DDA, and as you said, not all EBAs are the same. Not all partners report revenue the same way. So we really had a feeling that we were not necessarily getting the transparency also that we needed from all these partners, or what the various partners' goals were, or how many of our titles they were even offering, which we sometimes didn't have any control over. So in other words, how this really appeared from a librarian's perspective, which is what we are trying now to address by studying the various partners, and which is where the not level playing field comes in, because the motivations and the business models of the various partners are very, very different. And some are serving the scholarly community and our authors much, much better, I think, than others. And so we are involved in a whole investigation along those lines, also questioning, whether it is very smart for us to have all of our contents in an EBA model, and all of our front list titles in that model, when we also have a responsibility to authors, who don't even really know in most cases where their titles are being offered. So in many ways, the EBA model, the titles with with the most, or the DDA model with the most usage get picked. The others don't get picked. Where do the others? What does this leave? What are the others being left with? These kinds of decisions have real ramifications, some of which are being actually questioned by authors, by some of the agents that we deal with, who are asking us, well, what kinds of models are you in, and how are our authors being remunerated, because they obviously prefer the one copy, one royalty sale. So we are really looking at all of this and trying to find out, what is really best for our authors. And for the scholarly content, and what aligns best with our mission. That was a long answer to, I guess, very, very complicated questions. And we're working our way through all of this now.
I thought that was an excellent answer, and it really built on what Mary had said to start off responding to this. So besides all having been working at the same places at some point, your thinking is sort of aligned too. So Tim, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that first. And then, of course, we've all been long aware of Luminos, the open access platform at California. So maybe if you could go from the models and the complexity of the vendor landscape into your thoughts on open access fitting into all this somewhere, somehow.
Sure. To add more complications to it. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think the landscape is complicated. I think we're trying to serve multiple interests, right? We're trying to serve constituent interests among librarians and their institutions for our authors. We're entirely self-supporting, even though people think that, you know, UC funds us. And so there are these competing concerns in trying to figure out the balance that we can sustain the system going on is challenging to get all of those different interests right. I will say that I'm lucky to have, because I'm part of this giant system, I have 10 university librarians I can talk to. I've got 2 of them on my board of directors who are informing these kinds of decisions on a regular basis. I sit on the board for the California Digital Library. To get that perspective, I'm part of the Office of Scholarly Communications, so I hear kind of scholars' perspectives and librarians' perspectives there, and we're able to bring all of that together to at least inform the kinds of decisions we're making. On OA, I think we all know what the old system looked like flashback to 1970. Universities funded libraries. Libraries bought a whole bunch of monographs that university presses were publishing. You know, 2,500, you could do a print run. That's a lot of books today, 2,500 copies of a book. And then that money went into, right, the university funded libraries. Libraries paid university presses, and it was this nice ecosystem that helped produce knowledge and sustain knowledge creation. And that, you know, broke a long time ago, as Brigitte was saying earlier. In fact, I was going through some of my predecessors' papers, and I found a letter from 1946 where the director of the press then was complaining about the broken monograph model from just after World War II. So maybe monograph publishing worked from like 1890 to 1899, but it hasn't worked in a long time. And so I see OA on book publishing side is how do we figure out a new model that's sustainable to support that kind of scholarly publishing? How do we get back to an ecosystem where the funding is actually sustaining all of the different partners in the creation and availability of the knowledge that we're all working to produce? And Luminos is one model which has a bunch of different funding, you know, it's really a business model with a bunch of different funders behind it. I suspect some of the librarians on the call today helped to fund that model, and I want to thank them. It's not the only model, but I think it's the one we're trying to like pilot and figure out what works, how it works. What we have found is one, we suspect that we're reaching a much larger international audience than we do with our standard monograph publishing, because you don't have to pay to access the content. And so we can see through access reports where people are coming to that knowledge in a way that I just don't think they can if you're having in a standard monograph model. We also find that people really want the physical book. So even though you can access it free on your computer, people are still ordering the paperback because, I think about when I read a scholarly work and I want to mark it up. I want to have notes. I want to be able to pull it off the shelf to check stuff in a way that I don't want to be staring at my computer all the time. You know, there are a bunch of different reasons for it. And for that reason, we also find that the discoverability of open access leads to kind of more interesting sales patterns as well, individual sales patterns. And then we also have to figure out, because I think part of the operational piece within the press is how do we produce, how are we going to be efficient producers of these books? And to make sure that we're being efficient in the production of monographs, whether it's a traditional business model or an open access model, so that we can kind of maintain the flow within the press is something that we're currently wrestling with. You know, who are the partners we want to use to support those books? What are the technologies we want to use in-house to keep producing them?
Wonderful, thank you. We're getting some great questions, and looking at the clock, I have a feeling we're going to have more good questions than time to respond. So one of them goes back to something we were discussing earlier about the diversification of your list from, the origins of being publishing the scholar's work in the 1890s up till 1899, and then the diversification. So you have the Birds of Maine published by Princeton, and something Mary, I think, a very funny way, refers to as dad books. And Laura, you may have some comment on marketing those dad books. But what percent of your lists, I think we actually heard some of this earlier, about 65% scholarly monographs, Tim, you said, and the rest other things. But your lists have been diversifying of necessity. So some comment on that. And then the next question is about digital availability, which hopefully we can get to. That's an important question too. Mm-hmm. So Mary, why don't you start us off with the dad books?
Well, I'll quickly hand this over to our other colleagues. We all are at Penn, trying to diversify our lists, which actually is very scholarly. In books, quite monograph driven. Similar with journals, we do have 2 or 3 magazines rather than scholarly journals. But when we were talking about the so-called dad books, Tim, I told a story about my time in California when I was the liaison with the Mark Twain papers, and how that became such a huge, unexpectedly huge bestseller for California. And this is a funny example. I mean, it was not a deliberate diversification. The Mark Twain papers are an editorial group on the campus of UC Berkeley. It was a very, very scholarly edition of an unpublished manuscript. None of the hallmarks of a bestseller. The first volume was 800 pages, 50% scholarly apparatus. Would that go on to be the Christmas book that you bought for your dad if you were alive in the year it was published? That is not what anybody would have predicted. And yet it happened. So there is that funny way in which the more you get to the aim of reaching a broad public, the more you have to be open to surprises. But I think we do all try to diversify within a book list. Birds of Maine is an example of a reference type work. And many university presses do that really, really well because they have these scholarly experts close to hand. Again, California with a fantastic natural history list, as Princeton also has. With us, we're working on a big encyclopedia project on our great city of Philadelphia. Everybody needs that diversification. And again, it can be very mission driven. I highlighted our sort of regional identity, and we sort of see it that way. But I think, I think I'll turn it over to the 2 larger presses who are present here, because you two, Brigitte and Tim, have a ton of experience with that kind of thing.
Right. Well, Mary, when you say larger presses, I guess I would just point out Princeton publishes about 260 books a year, and California is 220. Do I have that right, Tim?
New titles around between 185 and 200.
Okay.
And we're at about 100, 110, and then 20 journals. And by comparison, I think, Tim, you said now that California has like 45 journals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think those numbers are important, because when you compare them to a Taylor and Francis or a Springer, where you're talking about thousands of titles per year, University Press is trying to survive on comparatively a very small number of titles.
Yeah, we're small, fat, and mighty compared to like Oxford, even, or much less Sage or Elsevier or one of the big 5.
Let me continue with that question about the diversification of your list, but at the same time, given that we only have a few minutes left, it would be nice to get a response for Stephanie Gross here about availability. I know what I've seen in my career is, for presses generally, academic scholarly presses, about 60% of books are available in some digital form on some platform. Not all platforms under the same models, but 60 is the high watermark generally. For university presses, it tends to be higher. It's closer to 70%. And I know for the presses that I work with right now, it tends to be above that on some platforms and some models. But there are, for some presses, embargoes of front list. So, or not participation in some models, maybe EBA or DDA, all those things. So when you talk about availability, you need to kind of parse it out in terms of what model. I do think, though, from what I've heard from presses, that as much as you can make it available, unlimited user, DRM free, you're open to doing that.
That's right, yeah.
Brigitte, maybe you want to jump in here first about diversification and then about availability.
Yeah,
each.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So diversification, I just counted to the spring 2021 list. So as we've been saying, we publish about 260 books a year. So that's about 130 or so, 130, 140 a season. So that spring 2021 list has 40 trade books, which is significant. And, with these trade books, we compete. I mean, about a third these days are agented. So we compete with Penguin Random House, with you name it, Basic, Farrar Straus, Verso, etc., etc. So it's a very, very competitive landscape. And we have really done this for quite a long time. We buy through agents, but one of the hallmarks of the press is really the deep knowledge of the editors of their various fields. So they're able to commission books and approach scholars. Very often they're first-time scholars, whose first monograph we've published, whose dissertations we've published, and ask them to write a more general interest book, which they then help conceive and help developmental edit, et cetera, et cetera. So we pay a lot of attention to the scholarly ecosystem. So as far as availability, I think we are also, well, what we're trying to do is make all of our titles available digitally. All of our titles have been available digitally since about 2010. Then in 2012, we embarked on a major project, basically digitizing all of our out-of-print books, of which there were 2,700. That's the Princeton Legacy Library. And then what we're involved with now is basically digitizing the rest of the books that have not been digitized yet, that are still in print, but never had a digital edition. Basically, a lot of the books that were published before 2010. And those are about 1,300 or so. And we have already digitized now in the last year, 730 of them. And we will further going forward this year, digitize hopefully the rest of them. Some of which are highly illustrated and have very complicated rights issues, all of which we are tackling collectively now.
Are rights issue one of the reasons you would not make a book available in digital format? And let me add to that, what would prevent you from putting a book into, this is a question that's here, into an evidence-based sales model?
I mean, rights are very important. Brigitte, we've done some very similar stuff with the backlist, and I know that California has done that. Many university presses have done this. And Mike, you talked about, trying to clarify or be transparent about why digital can be more expensive, even though people often think that it's less expensive. But we're often doing it over again, so to speak. It's not cost-free to take an older book that didn't have a digital edition and give it a digital edition. And Fred Nachbauer, who I think was listening in on part of this, he and I were talking to another press director recently who was asking about, well, how should she budget for making her backlist digital? And Fred and I both said, spend hours and hours in the budget on the rights. Do you have the right to do this? Are you sure? Is the author still alive? Can you ask them? If they're not, what does their family think? Well, what if it's heavily illustrated? That can cost hours of time for a single book. And many of us do it because we believe that the availability is an accessibility issue, a mission-oriented issue, but it isn't just the cost of the digital file. There are many other hidden costs.
Yeah, those operational costs can be extraordinary. and the opportunity cost. What are you not doing as a consequence of pursuing those kinds of initiatives? We had, when we were going through, and still going through digitization projects, but having people literally going to find the print books from, decades ago to bring in, and then go through and then to deal with the super musty smell that's emanating from the offices where these books are stored, and paging through weird format books from the 30s. It was all great, but boy, it takes a whole lot of time and person hours to get some of that done, let alone then chasing down who might the right holder be. Like, who bought whoever had the rights to this book, and where do they, and do they care? And yeah, the operational details are pretty extraordinary.
Agreed.
Let me ask you this. It would seem to me on the surface, a print book is cheap, $35 paperback if I buy it new, and maybe $60 hardcover if that's all there is. Whereas an ebook, typically these days, single user is up closer to $100 for a UP and much more for the commercial presses. Which for you, which is more expensive for you to publish? I guess I'm looking at, do you make a huge profit on ebooks because they're so much more expensive, but isn't the book the same? Is that, Mary, do you want to take a stab at that first?
It's the same up to a point, and that's why it doesn't cost less. Same acquisition process, same copy editing process, same typesetting process, same file, all the same. You cut your printing costs off maybe, or you cut them down, but that's about it. But the dynamism of the market costs us a lot. We were talking about that before, sort of managing the ebooks, but also the dynamism of technology. I was in a meeting earlier today with one of Penn's IT people, and we were playing that game of how long you've been in the business. And he said, well, the first time I created code, it was on cards. Mm-hmm. Well, we have a version of that. And you actually alluded to that, Mike. Codices are a proven technology for 2 millennia. Digital, not so much. And we've already seen a lot of file format graduation, a lot of, preservation issues, which libraries, previously, as Tim indicated, you called up the library if you needed an old book, and they were doing the preservation for you. They were keeping it safe. Now we share that responsibility with the libraries. If something needs to be available digitally, the press is responsible for the originating file, the version of record, and keeping it safe, digitally secure, graduating its format if need be, providing it in multiple formats. Like librarians, of course, okay, PDFs, fine, but why not have the dynamic, EPUB? Well, it doesn't cost nothing to change it to an EPUB. So there are these sort of hidden costs that are kind of the stewardship costs of digital. And we share a lot of them with libraries. And so I think the librarians listening can kind of nod and recognize these, but that we didn't have those costs back in the day when the playing field was supposedly level.
I've heard publishers say that switching or adding another distribution channel, a digital distribution channel, is expensive, and they look at it very carefully. I remember one press near where I live saying they were invited to join UPSO, but they couldn't add one more platform. It was going to be too cumbersome and expensive for them to do. Is that another part of this, managing the digital workflows?
Yep, very much so. We've just hired an additional person for the digital team just because of exactly that, because each partner comes with different ideas and different demands and different conversion issues and different, just general different questions. Each partner comes with, you need to meet with partners. Partners need to be managed. So yes. There are many hidden costs that are not immediately obvious. I mean, basically everything that Mary just said so well.
I see our host, Anne, has reappeared.
On cue. So if I'm not interrupting a good discussion, I think it's time for us to wrap up. Mike, is there anything else you would like to add?
just a big thank you. I think these discussions, I hope they're helpful. They're very informative for me. I know we only touch on topics lightly. I hope we'll have venues, maybe Charleston in the fall, where we can have some kind of meeting where we bring all of you together with the librarians and have an in-person meeting. But thank you. This has been really, really interesting for me.
Thank you so much for making this possible, Michael and Anne.
Of course.
And others at De Gruyter.
Big thanks to De Gruyter for this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone on the panel and all the attendees. Just a reminder that we will be sending out the recording soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.